White balance is one of those settings that every photographer struggles with at some point. You're told it's there to neutralize an image, which is true, but what's rarely explained is why does a photo have to be neutral, and why a color cast may actually be the best thing for an image. In this video, I'll break it all down step by step, what white balance is really for, the tools Lightroom gives you to fix it, the difference between the temperature and tint sliders, what the eyedropper tool really does and how to use it, and then what those drop down menu presets are really doing to your photo. And most importantly, I'll be clearing up the biggest misconceptions, leaving you with a simple structure that you can use for every photo. My name's Tony Eveling and I'm a landscape photographer from the UK. And if you're new here, then make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss future videos. And don't forget, there's a chapter list down in the description below so that you can jump to exactly what you need. Okay then, let's get started. So let's start with a big question. What is white balance actually for? Well, it's about removing an unwanted color cast so that whites look white and greys look grey. And if that happens, then all of the objects in your photograph, regardless of their color, those colors will all look neutral and natural. So let's come up to the white balance, which hides in the basics panel. Open it up and you can see the white balance section at the top there, and it consists of three main elements. So you've got the eyedropper tool on the left, and we'll be talking about that in a minute, and that is a really handy tool to have in certain circumstances. We've got the temperature and tint sliders in the middle, which allows you to manually control white balance if you want. And then we've got the preset menu on the right hand side. If I open that up, there's a whole list of presets there that give us sort of arbitrary fixed adjustments according to what we choose, daylight, cloudy or whatever. And again, we'll be going through that a bit later. I've got as shot chosen, which is the default for the image. And what that has done is taken the settings from the camera and applied it to this image. And this image is a raw file, so Lightroom has the advantage here with a raw file of always going from the actual data that was recorded on the sensor to start off with, which is something that you don't get with a JPEG or a TIFF file. We're going to leave that there for now, and let's go to these two sliders here, the temperature and tint slider. So what Lightroom is doing, it's taking the as shot settings to create this setting where it's put the slider to the left on the cooler side of that temperature slider with warmer values over to the right. So if I just manually move that over to the right, you'll see that the temperature warms up on the image. And if I stop there, you get a kind of muddy look because you don't always want to change your white balance settings. You might want to tweak them, but I don't necessarily want to neutralize this image. I was happy with the blue. Maybe that was too much blue, but this has now just created a muddy look. And I don't know for sure if that's completely neutral because I've done this manually. So if we just come up to the right hand side and just click there, so that's the maximum value that you can add. If we come down to the left hand side and add maximum cooling, then you get this kind of weird electric blue look, which is not what we want. And as you can see, the scale is slightly different to other sliders. Most sliders have 0 in the middle and then go out to -100 and +100. With the temperature scale, it's in degrees Kelvin. You have 2000 degrees Kelvin on the left and 50,000 degrees Kelvin on the right, and you don't have 0 in the middle. It's just a numerical scale from 2 to 50,000 degrees Kelvin, and that's that. So double click to get the mode default back. And the tint slider, well, that moves between green and magenta. And in the olden days, you used to get these fluorescent lights, and these fluorescent lights lit a room this bright intense white color. Recorded on a sensor would be a lot of green light from those fluorescent lights, and the tint slider is really to address the problems that you get in artificial lighting in that respect. So if we go over to the left to the green side, it adds green, and if we go to the right side, it adds magenta. Not relevant to this image to any great deal. So let's just quickly clear up some misconceptions with white balance. White balance does not affect exposure. It doesn't brighten or darken the image and doesn't affect luminosity at all. It only changes color temperature or that green magenta balance. and it's not color grading. Color grading is done elsewhere in Lightroom. White balance is for neutralizing a color or a color cast, and color grading is for stylizing. So if we just shut that basics panel down, we've got the color grading tool here that is specifically designed for color grading, and then you can also color grade in the tone curve, color mixer, and calibration down there. So white balance is for neutralizing, and although you can add a color cast if you want it a bit warmer or cooler, you can manually make those changes. So now let's have a look at the eyedropper tool. So we choose the eyedropper tool, hover over our image, and we get that loop, that grid of pixels there, so we can see each individual pixel. The little crosshairs in the center corresponds with what my eyedropper tool is hovering over, and then you've got those three numbers at the bottom, the red, green and blue values in percentage terms. So for example, with the pixel I'm hovering over, the red value is 27.6, then the green is 31 and the blue is 49. So you can see that there is more blue than red or green. So bearing in mind that white balance is about neutralizing, this eyedropper tool will seek to neutralize your image based on what you tell it to do. So what you've got to do is go over any part of the image that is a shade that should be a shade of grey. So it's not going to be a shade of grey because you've got a color cast in your image that you're trying to neutralize. So that's the whole point of this eyedropper tool. So I know that clouds are grey, and we've got some dark clouds up there. They should be grey if there was no color cast. So look at the numbers at the bottom there. So I've got 22, 25, 41 for blue. Click the eyedropper tool, and that's neutralized that pixel there to turn it to 30, 30 and 30. So it's increased the red and the green, and the changes that it had to make to that pixel has now been propagated out to every single pixel in the image, and that neutralizes the image. So that's what that eyedropper tool does. You can put it on black or white, but you don't know for sure if you've got clipping in those blacks and whites. So always put it on a shade of grey. And as you can see, my temperature slider has gone right up to 21,000 degrees Kelvin on that right hand side, and it's increased the tint a little bit. So very cleverly it's worked out that these are the changes that it has to make those clouds grey. And because they would be grey in real life, I've now got a perfectly neutralized photograph, and it hasn't had to adjust any other slider or anything in Lightroom. Just those two sliders there, the temperature and tint. So let's just put that eyedropper tool back, and let's have a look at the white balance now, which is changed to custom because I've made some changes to those sliders. Let's open up the drop down menu. So each of these options seeks to neutralize the color cast. So the cloudy settings adds red because on cloudy days the clouds naturally filters out red, leaving a bluish color cast, or when I say red's like a warmer color tone. And each option works the same way, trying to neutralize the image in terms of its color cast. So if I just click on cloudy, it's going to warm it up, but not to the degree that it was warmed up. So if I go to as shots, it's down at 4950 on the temperature scale. If I go to cloudy, it's shoved it along to the right to warm it up a bit. So that's quite a subtle look. And then if I go to shade, which it should warm it up a bit more, which it does do. So it goes up 1,000 degrees there, and so on. Then we have the artificial lights here. So tungsten is warm yellow light that you get indoors with domestic lights. So that will cool it right down because you're telling Lightroom that the picture was taken with warm artificial lighting. If we click that, it cools it right down too far. And the fluorescent settings will add magenta to remove green because you're telling Lightroom that this photo was taken under fluorescent lighting. But what I tend not to apply these settings. I just go to the auto button on a raw file, remember, just go to auto and let Lightroom sort it out and see what it makes of it. And actually that is a look that I quite like. That's much more subtle than what we had, but it hasn't warmed it up so much that we've got that muddy look back. So I'm happy with that just by clicking the auto button in that presets. So let's look at another image now, and this one has a strong magenta color cast that I don't want. And I think it's just the combination of overcast evening lights, just dark enough for the street lights to come on, all combining to create that magenta look, which I don't want. So I can come into my white balance section here, take my eyedropper tool, and then I can hover over my image, get my loop there, And if you look at the navigator panel on the left, as I shift that eyedropper tool, you get a preview in that thumbnail. So what I need to do is to hover over somewhere that should be neutral grey, and also something that looks all right in that preview panel. And if I just click there, and again look at those values at the bottom, 33, 28, 34, so the green value is lower than red and blue. Just click and it's evened those up. So I've got 28, 28, 28, and it's neutralized the image. So that's given me a really good start for post-processing this image. And here's one I prepared earlier in this snapshot here. That's kind of the finished image, so I'm really happy with that. But first, because it had that really horrible color cast, I had to get rid of that first before I started post-processing. And now I want to show you this photo because it was taken on a sunny day at noon. So this should be naturally neutral. I shouldn't have to do anything to this to neutralize the image. So if I go in at 50% and drag this over to these little boats here in the distance. So I've got these tiny little boats here in the distance, and I've got the front of that hull there. I can't go over here because that might be not quite accurate, because some of those pixels might be blown out. So I come to this grey area here, which is in shadow, so I know that that should be neutral grey. Whether it is or not doesn't matter, it should be neutral grey. Doesn't matter about the luminosity value, but actually if you look at the figures there at the bottom, you can see 44 for red, then 45 and 43, so it is pretty much spot on neutral. So if I just click that, that changes it to 45, 45, 45. It kind of warms it up a little bit, but very subtle effect there. And that's just an example of actually when you do take a photo on a sunny day at noon, you do actually get neutral colors. So now we go back to my original photo, and that is not my final finished image. I've now corrected the blue color cast. I've dampened it down a bit, but here's a version of this image that I prepared earlier. And that is my final finished image after processing it. So adjusting the white balance initially to get rid of that strong harsh blue color cast, but just dampening it down a bit, and then adding my normal post-processing adjustments after that. So let's just go through a few bits and pieces. RAW versus JPEG. So RAW file always gives you full flexibility, and you can change white balance endlessly because Lightroom is always going back to the original raw data from the sensor. But with a JPEG, you've already made changes to your exposure, contrast, your highlights, your shadows. You've applied a white balance specifically to it, and you've burnt that into your image, discarding the raw data. So there's no more raw data anymore. Your starting point is that pre-processed JPEG image. So you can never go back to the sensor data again. It's not a huge deal if you've got a very high quality kind of first generation image, if you like, straight off the camera. So for me, I always take a raw file, and I always take the highest quality JPEG as well. And actually when you put a JPEG of that quality into Lightroom, you get something very similar to a raw file. But you do have to be careful depending on the changes that were initially made in order to create that JPEG. So I always play safe, always use raw. You know, these days disk storage is so cheap that you don't have to take JPEGs in order to save on storage. And then there's a few common beginner mistakes, I suppose. Again, you shouldn't think that images should all be neutral. They don't need to be neutral. They can be any shade of whatever color cast you seek fit for the image. Try and visualize the image when you're out there taking it. What do you want it to look like? When you are in dusk conditions and it's cloudy, you're going to have a feeling of coolness. So that's probably going to work for the final finished image. So don't think that you need to make all your images neutral. And lastly, you're not looking for perfection. Nothing is ever perfect. If it looks right to you, then it is right. And that is always the bottom line. So I'm really happy with this image, and I'm going to stick with that. So here are some quickfire questions related to white balance. How do I judge and choose the right white balance? Well, white balance should be a creative choice, not just a technical one. So don't feel locked into neutralizing everything. Go with what looks right for your photo, and only you know what that is. Should I be using a grey card for white balance? Well, a grey card like this one gives you a guaranteed neutral point, and you can use the eyedropper tool on it in Lightroom for accuracy. Similar to what I did with the clouds in this shot. but I personally never use one. I'd rather just trust my eye and go for what looks best creatively. Does shooting RAW mean that I don't need to worry about white balance? Well, pretty much yes. RAW captures the data without locking in white balance, so that you can set it however you want later in Lightroom. That said, it's still about making a creative choice, not just fixing it by neutralizing the image. How do you handle white balance in outdoor ever-changing light? Well, again, shooting RAW means that you can adjust white balance however you like later. What matters is your creative preference for an image, not some kind of technical neutrality. Should I just leave my camera on auto white balance? Again, if you're shooting RAW, then auto white balance is fine. Just know that it can shift between shots in the same scene, giving slightly different casts. I prefer setting mine to cloudy or daylight so that my thumbnails look consistent, but that's just my personal choice. And finally, what's your own process for all of this? Well, to be honest, I don't do much with white balance. Most of the time I leave it as shot, or usually just out of curiosity, I might try auto. And then I can tweak it slightly at the end of editing a photo just to get everything perfect. Only when it's obviously wrong, like in these examples, do I correct it first before post-processing. And it's really these two methods that are the reason why I made this video. It's so important not to stress over white balance. And I only use it in any significant way to correct something that is obviously wrong, which isn't that often. And one last reminder. White balance is nothing to do with exposure. So if you have images that are too dark or too light, then that is an exposure issue, nothing to do with white balance. And if you want to see all of this in action, then check out this video next, because in it I take an image with some obvious white balance problems plus exposure issues and walk you through how I fixed it step by step.